new title. I got to figure out a new title for myself. The Chief Innovation Officer, Director of Labcftc, and basically formed and created Labcftc for us. So he's done a great job in pulling all this together. Daniel's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where he teaches a course on fintech law and policy. So probably a pretty innovative course too. Most recently, he was vice president and associate general counsel at On Deck, served as a director of financial market policy and legal counsel at the Milken Institute think tank, where he focused on technology-driven financial innovation, capital access, and financial market policy. Worked at the law firm of Covington and Burling, so international law firm, that's great. Graduate of Brown University, George Washington University Law School, and Johns Hopkins for an MA. So Dan, thank you, we're delighted. You can give an overview of Labcftc and then we'll jump into the FinTech panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kevin. And yeah, I joked with my panelists that my job is to warm up the crowd, of course, with all these bad jokes before we bring the panel up. But in any event, great to be back here this year for the International Symposium. What I'm going to do today is spend a few minutes talking a little bit about FinTech. What is FinTech? What are some of the characteristics or attributes of FinTech that may require new regulatory approaches or regulatory frameworks? And I'll share a little bit about how we're tackling that here at the CFTC through the Labcftc initiative. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit. Let's try to define FinTech. And you see here, I've got a simple definition that was offered by some students at the FinTech Club at the University of Pennsylvania, where they say FinTech is an economic industry composed of companies that use technology to make financial systems more efficient. So, I leave it to the audience as well to think a little bit about how is it that we can define FinTech. But at a very simple, basic level, I like to think of things along a continuum or a spectrum. And I think a lot of the FinTech innovation that I think we're all seeing in our various markets and jurisdictions, a portion of it focuses on the retail banking side of the world, so innovations in lending, innovations in payments, and perhaps even robo-advisory platforms. And then across the spectrum, you have a fair amount of activity taking place in capital markets. And a lot of the underpinnings of this innovation really cuts across both retail banking and capital markets. A lot of the innovation is driven by the advent of the internet and how the internet continues to have an impact across economic sectors. But from a CFTC perspective, we are more interested in that portion of the spectrum that focuses on capital markets and where we're seeing innovation. So some of the areas that I would flag or highlight that have been of especial importance to us include things like digital assets and cryptocurrencies. As you've heard talked about throughout this conference, we saw the launch of Bitcoin futures products at the end of 2017. So virtual assets, digital assets has become a very prominent area for us. More broadly, distributed ledger technologies. And when I talk about DLT, I'm talking about some of the private or permissioned network systems that we're seeing impact some of the infrastructure within markets, all the way to the open public blockchains. And I'll probably save till the Q&A portion going any deeper into the spectrum of activity within DLT. We're also looking a lot at machine learning and artificial intelligence, the way that machine learning is impacting various areas, whether it be regulatory technologies, supervisory technologies, automated and algorithmic trading. We are looking at cloud technology and the impact that that's having on innovation, digital identities, and then as I mentioned before, regtech or subtech as it's applied in the supervisory sense. Now, there's a bit of a debate as to whether there's really anything new this time around FinTech, and I've heard many make a proper observation that we've seen technology and innovation impact financial markets for decades. The ATM was developed in the 1960s. We've had electronic trading platforms now for decades. So what is it that's new here to the extent that there is anything new? Now, I'm going to list out here a few characteristics of the innovation that we're seeing today that I do think, at least from a regulatory perspective, presents new challenges. The first one is around speed. And when I talk about speed, there's kind of two components of speed. There's speed in the development of new business models, and there's speed in terms of adoption. Now, when we talk about the development of new models or new operating systems, it's really tied to computing power. We've seen exponential increases in the power of computing. There's that concept of Moore's law, which states that semiconductors will continue to halve in size as they grow exponentially in power. And at the same time, we're seeing decreases in the cost of computing. So when you merge those two together, it explains why you're seeing new business models develop and iterate far faster than what we've seen historically. Now, the flip side is around adoption and scalability. So if you think about what the internet and mobile mean for adoption, it's pretty powerful. Whereas historically, it would take a financial institution, maybe a few decades to scale up nationally or internationally, because they literally needed to buy buildings in every jurisdiction that they would operate. And so by the time they scaled to, say, a national level here in the US, they probably had really large, robust legal and compliance teams. Now, a digital payment platform can scale up nationally or internationally in the span of maybe a year or so. You may have 15 or 20 people working at the company, and it starts facilitating billions of dollars in payments transactions in very short order. Now, likely, those types of enterprises or firms don't have the same level of robust legal compliance systems built out. So what does that mean for regulators? And I pose that as a question and as a challenge. How do you share expectations of the regulator with that type of an innovator? And how do you think about applying rules and frameworks that probably envisioned a very different looking business model when they were first created? The second characteristic is around disintermediation. And when I say disintermediation, a lot of the innovations we're seeing today are trying to either disintermediate traditional gatekeepers or traditional actors in financial markets, or transform the way that those intermediaries operate. And as all of you know, most financial regulation is focused on the intermediary. We regulate exchanges, we regulate banks, we regulate broker-dealers. So what does it mean when you think about disintermediation of those actors or changing the way they function? The next characteristic here is industry convergence. And what I mean by this is that a lot of these new business models, again, are just built on the internet. And the internet doesn't recognize traditional geographic boundaries or borders, whether at the national level or at the internet or at the international level. It also means that different areas of the economy or traditionally different sectors can actually compete head-on for the same services and the same customers. So when we think about payments, and again, in many international jurisdictions, we're seeing telecom companies, technology companies, traditional financial institutions, all compete for the same customer with the same activities. The last thing here that I'll add is around technological literacy. I think that what makes perhaps this time different is that we're seeing across the economy, and certainly within financial markets and services, that technology is playing a tremendous role in powering business models and operations. And I question whether at the highest levels of business or in government or at regulatory bodies, do we have the technological literacy and understanding to keep up with some of these new models? We all know that things like cybersecurity are really important, but how many people can peel multiple layers down in the onion to make sure that we really understand whether the systems and safeguards that we have in place or that we're requiring to be in place are appropriate? So given all of these characteristics, there was a view here at the CFTC that we need to be proactive and forward-looking in terms of how we engage with new technologies. There's an expression that comes from the world of hockey where we say we need to skate to where the puck is actually headed, knowing that the world is going to change pretty quickly. So what can we do to keep pace? And that was the impetus for the launch of Labcftc here at the agency last summer.